Welcome back to the Alec Lewis Show. I am your host, Alec Lewis. This is episode 140, recording on Wednesday, January 14th, a day after Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, the Vikings GM, and Kevin O'Connell, the Vikings head coach, had their end-of-season press conferences. Got a lot of thoughts from what was said at the TCO Performance Center on Tuesday. We're going to talk about the quarterback conversations. We're going to talk about Brian Flores. We'll talk about Mike Pettin and the staff, Jordan Addison's arrest. All of it we will get into on today's show, which is presented by First Resource Bank. And if you guys don't know about it, you should. It is a member FDIC bank in the Minneapolis area, run by really good people who had as tough of a time observing the nature of this season as you did. Tim Siegley, Aaron Siegley, Charlie Anderson, really good people. They care about the community, and their banking platform, a member FDIC banking platform, is phenomenal. So please go check out First Resource. Information is in the description below. If you're new here and watching on YouTube, first, thanks for being here. I cover the team every day. It's my job, even in the offseason. I'll be watching draft player film. I'll be talking to people about coaching situation. I will be observing what is possible from a cap and free agency perspective for The Athletic. That's what I do. We do this show 2 times a week. We usually bring in guests, and we will have a ton of them in the weeks and months to come. So thanks for being here. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, you can rate and review, and all of that stuff helps us out. Took a while to get the post press conference, post first weekend of the playoff games episode out. Was under the weather because, of course, like when the season ends, for some reason, it's probably like for you guys and your jobs as well. When you finish some big project, when you finish some cycle, Q3, Q4, whatever the heck it is, you hit a point where your body says you had enough. And after a season like this one, I think the body was extremely worn down from what was a journey that will stand the test of time, is what I would say. But we're going to start first with the conversation about the quarterback. And I mean, the phrase that Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi Adofo-Mensah kept using, or the descriptions, the way they termed it in terms of what they want for their quarterback room moving forward, is a deep and talented quarterback room. They want to build a deep and talented quarterback room into 2026. And my first thought is like, everybody's trying to build a deep and talented quarterback room. It's the most important component of this sport that I cover and that you guys watch and consume. And so it's a challenge to do that. But it was telling to me that that phrase was used by both the GM and the head coach in terms of the strategy as they enter the press conference and what they wanted to say. Now, Kevin O'Connell also made it very clear and was very open from the outset of the press conference, really, that the Vikings want competition at the quarterback position. Like the way I phrased the question to him, like, do you feel like you need competition or to guarantee competition to be able to potentially acquire the right players to build your coveted deep and talented quarterback room? And Kevin O'Connell was like, yes, I think you absolutely need competition. You know, he paired that with his reiterating of the excitement about what he saw from J.J. McCarthy throughout the last 4 games. But again, similar to the phrasing of wanting a deep and talented quarterback room, the united conversation from both of the decision makers about wanting competition, preferring competition at the position, for me, was telling. Now, I will say this. It is a sensible thing to say in a press conference like that for a lot of reasons. One, it leaves all of the options open. And I wrote this for Tuesday, but if you have observed the way that Kwesi Adofo-Mensah specifically talks about decision-making and processes and plans, rarely does he box it, in press conference form or even in other conversations, like rarely does he want to box himself in terms of the path the paths, plural, that the Vikings might be able to take. And so, it was a sensible thing to talk about competition because A, it leaves the door open for J.J. McCarthy to have a phenomenal offseason and to show up in the spring at voluntary OTAs and be ripping it with consistent footwork and layering and everything that the Vikings have talked relentlessly about wanting to see from him on a consistent basis for more than a year now. So it leaves that door open. And it also, when you speak about competition in a press conference setting like that and wanting competition, being very forward about that, it also works to and helps establish the external perception to potential quarterbacks on the market that that those quarterbacks could enter this building and have a very good chance at winning a job, which is what most of these quarterbacks prefer, especially when they're signing short-term deals. Like a little detour and quick aside, I mean, a lot of these quarterbacks who are in this area of the market, what I would say, where, you've proven enough to get a certain amount of guarantees for a year or two from a team. A lot of those quarterbacks and their agents their attempt is to have a great season or two and set that player up or themselves up, if it's the player's perspective, to perform really well, to then generate more certainty and guarantees either on the open market or from that same team into the future. So these agents and these players, specifically at quarterback, are very strategic, purposeful, and aware of team situations, of commitments that the teams have made to other quarterbacks. Like that is a big factor oftentimes in the decisions that these quarterbacks make. I mean, the best example is Daniel Jones from last season. The Vikings were willing, from last offseason, the Vikings were willing to pay Daniel Jones at the same amount, if not more, than the Indianapolis Colts were. But the perception from Daniel Jones' perspective was that he would have a much better chance of winning the job in Indianapolis over Anthony Richardson than he would in Minnesota, where the team invested what they did in J.J. McCarthy and hadn't seen really what he was or what he could be. And that was the correct bet from him. I mean, there were a lot of factors in that Daniel Jones decision beyond just that. I mean, Daniel Jones was able to assess what that offensive line looks like. The offensive line coach there, Tony Sparano Jr., the job he's done, having a running back in Jonathan Taylor. Their receiving core was one of the most underrated in the NFL, with guys like Alec Pierce and Michael Pittman and their tight ends with the rookie Tyler Warren. Like that was from a player's perception and perspective and an agent's probably wisdom, that was a phenomenal decision by Daniel Jones, who was having a great season until the injury. And I will say this, I went back and watched some of the film the other day of Daniel Jones kind of before the injury, struggling a little bit, but he was still throwing it over the middle of the field, throwing with accuracy, playing on time, playing in rhythm. So you understood why the Colts paid him. You understood why the Vikings wanted him back the way that they did. But I to come back to the point here from the Vikings point of view, to create the perception externally at the bare minimum that you are willing to, have a competition at the quarterback position, it's a smart thing to do. And it's something that obviously differs from how last offseason felt. Now, I have written this and I have said this on the radio, and I'll say it again. I am still of the belief, from everything I know, that the Vikings could find a starter in some form who, by the nature of either what he's paid, what he's acquired for, or just who he is from a stature perspective, that he would be the starter. Like, I'm still a belief that if the Vikings can find that type of player, then perhaps it would be less of a competition and more of a guarantee. From everything I know, it's just going to be more the matter of what exists. I mean, if you're talking the acquisition channel via trade, what's possible? What are other teams willing to do? Who are other teams willing to part with? All of those conversations probably have not been had to this point, and I would expect them to be had over the next few months. And then the way I view it from there is it's kind of like tiers, or like the level of shopping that you're willing to do. You know, from everything I know, the Vikings will pursue that most premium, high level, possibility. If that doesn't exist, then you bump down a tier and you see what's possible from there. And that is where, if there is not a quarterback available at those premium tiers, and you find yourself in a similar spot to last offseason, where it's like, we can find a guy with a good amount of experience who we believe would fit in this system, but there are other teams vying for him, so we have to win that negotiation. Part of winning that negotiation is that quarterback and his representatives' belief that this opportunity is the best fit. And I think so much of what was said Tuesday works toward establishing the parameters that would intrigue that type of player, is what I would say. So from the quarterback conversation, that was kind of my biggest takeaway from how Tuesday played out. I thought there were some ancillary conversations related to quarterback that were interesting. Judd Zulgad asked Kevin O'Connell essentially like if he regrets the amount of conversation and discussion about mechanics publicly that happened throughout the middle part of the season. There wasn't really a definitive answer. And it's just, it's my understanding that behind the scenes, the Vikings were repping the footwork because it's what all of these teams do. Like I said this a few weeks ago, but Matt LaFleur and the Packers have gotten a lot of praise for the development of Malik Willis. And so much of that development, frankly, if you read anything, if you talk to people behind the scenes, has been a focus on footwork. The same focus that Kevin O'Connell essentially and this Viking staff took with J.J. McCarthy. Now, did Kevin O'Connell have to talk as much publicly as he did about that? It probably depends on your viewpoint and what you think. But I still would say that over the back half of the season, when J.J. McCarthy was most successful throwing the football and being accurate, the footwork was right. So, I think that was an interesting conversation. And the other one that, really intrigued me, and it's why I asked the question to Kevin O'Connell at the end of the press conference, was essentially the question I asked: do you feel like J.J. McCarthy needs any type of mechanical overhaul to throw the football beyond just furthered improvement from a footwork, base, balance, rhythm perspective? And Kevin, most of the answer was about footwork and less about kind of a movement pattern restructure that Josh Allen, for example, undertook after his first season. And so, this is an interesting conversation to me because it speaks a little bit to the perspective of a lot of these coaches in the industry of how quarterback and throwing mechanics have been taught for years, paired with kind of how mechanics in many ways are being trained at this current period of football that maybe differs from years past. So it's kind of like, the best way I know how to get into this conversation a little bit is pitchers oftentimes are in the season in Major League Baseball, and I covered baseball for 3 years, so I have a pretty detailed understanding of it. In the season, there's not that many mechanical adjustments because it's really hard to tweak something, to change a movement pattern, and then apply that on the mound in a real game. It's really difficult. And then in the offseason, certain pitchers take certain perspectives. Some of them, they develop with their team. Whatever the pitching coach says for that team, that's kind of the way their developmental process, that's the path they take. Other guys are like, you know what? I'm going to take my career into my own hands. I'm going to go seek development from an ancillary, hub of of development, whether it's drive line baseball, whether it's these pockets of more new age development. And if the team gets mad at that, then they do. If the team doesn't, then great. And some MLB teams are more okay with their players going outside to develop than others. I can say, like, I covered the Kansas City Royals, like I said, for years, they were not okay with players going externally and listening to people who they didn't trust for development. And then over the years, as it's become more commonplace in Major League Baseball, the teams have, and the Royals specifically, relaxed on their frustration about players doing that. So with JJ McCarthy, like, it's just going to be interesting from my standpoint to see who is he working with this offseason, how much of that aligns with directly what the Vikings want. Are the Vikings going to be okay with that? Does JJ McCarthy feel like he needs to alter his movement patterns from a whether it's using plyo balls, whether it's strength and conditioning, biomechanically, or does it feel like I just need to rep the footwork time and time again? That conversation is an interesting one for me this offseason to kind of navigate. But as far as quarterback, that's kind of that, that's how I viewed things coming out of Tuesday. And I'm sure I will get the questions on this show and in print, and they will be consistent and relentless, understandably, from you guys. And they should be, because it's the correct question of, okay, so who makes sense as the type of pair, whether it's competition or even greater. And it's difficult to come up with like the option that is perfect, that threads the needle. I mean, you could talk about certain players like Mac Jones or Tanner McKee, guys who are younger, who have shown some good stuff on tape, guys who in this system with this receiving core you'd have confidence in. But those players are both with other teams, and they're probably going to take draft capital, and the Vikings need draft capital to supplement this aging roster with young players. So that becomes kind of a complication. Then you could talk about certain free agents, whether it's a Malik Willis or it's a Kirk Cousins. With a Malik Willis, how many opportunities is he going to have? Do the Vikings believe he can throw over the middle of the field the way they want their offense to kind of operate? With a Kirk Cousins, what are the opportunities going to be? How much does he really want to come back? And would he be willing to do that if there's no guarantee for him, to be the starter? I mean, like, those are, I'm just naming players who are feasible in my mind, that make sense as far as fits with what this team does and wants to do. But that's, again, that's going to be the conversation of the next few weeks and months. And I would tell you that doing my job, intel probably comes closer to the time periods at which decisions have to be made, which is typically early March and the Senior Bowl's at the end of the month. So that's a lot of people are together. That's where information starts to flow. So it'll be interesting to see over the course of the next few weeks and months how things progress from that standpoint. Before we get to the next topic, a quick word from another one of our sponsors who was awesome throughout the entire season, Unreal Clothing Brand. I'm repping it right now, wearing it almost every day at this point. And I don't know what else to say. These guys, it's phenomenal apparel. They've got everything: hoodies, joggers, Vikings limited edition, row the boat gear. It's high level stuff. It's athleisure. That's what they tell me. Something that makes you look cooler, probably at least make me look much cooler than I am. But a great clothing brand based out of St. Paul. And I really like supporting people in the local community who I think are doing really good things, both here and nationally. So the information, their website is in the description, but really good stuff from Unreal. Highly recommend going to check out what they've got. And they do, during the season, limited edition drops and hoodies on a weekly basis, essentially, that are high level. I mean, it's high level stuff. So Unreal, please go check them out. The next topic that was probably the most interesting from Tuesday Was about Brian Flores. I will say this: Brian Flores, from everything I understand, interviewed Wednesday for the Baltimore Ravens head coaching job. That's going to be a very hard job to get in the sense that they're interviewing a ton of candidates, offensive and defensive, guys who have been head coaches in the past. And that's a very well run organization. You have conversations with people throughout the league when you cover this sport for 4 seasons the way I have. And if you were to make a hierarchy of the most respected, forward thinking, probably collaborative, synergy, you want to use all those buzzwords that get thrown out there in every building. Those really apply to Baltimore. Their ownership, Steve Bisciotti, he does a really good job and is very aware. And then their GM, Eric DeCosta, is widely regarded as one of the best in the NFL, has a deep scouting background, working with Ozzie Newsome, who did it at one of the highest levels ever in that job, and really good people skills, and is willing to listen to the analytics side. Again, has the scouting experience. So it's a really well-run organization. It's going to be a very competitive job opening. And it sounds like they're going to bring in probably 3 to 5 final candidates. It'll be interesting to see if Brian Flores is in that mix or not. I do know that Eric DeCosta, the GM of the Ravens, is really close with Ryan Grigson, the Vikings number 2. So if Eric wanted a reference from here on how things have gone, Ryan would be definitely someone that he could look toward for insights for sure. But my impression of that job would be that it's going to be a tough one to acquire, whether you're Brian Flores or anybody. Kevin O'Connell on Wednesday essentially said the team has been very aggressive in terms of getting a contract done with Brian Flores to be the team's defensive coordinator for the future. Kevin also was pretty forward in that, he's expecting the deal to get done. That it hasn't happened yet is interesting to me, and it speaks to a lot of things. One of them is certainly not probably that Brian Flores wants to become a free agent and test the market and see what his value is and assess what's out there. There are a lot of teams right now with open head coaching positions, guys who are going to want to hire defensive coordinators. There are a lot of there are multiple teams who have fired or let go of their defensive coordinator. So there's going to be a lot of pursuit from potential head coaching hires and current head coaching hires for defensive coaches. And there is no question the amount of respect that Brian Flores has within the industry for what he's done on the defensive side of the football in Minnesota. I mean, I've said this many times. He took a defense that was 23rd in DVOA in 2022 and jumped to 11th without a ton of personnel change. Then took 11th from 11th in 2023 to 3rd in 2024, and then to 2nd in 2025 without a ton of crazy personnel improvements, specifically via the draft, which is a testament to the scheme, the ability to adapt in game, which is very underrated. It's part of what I think makes Ben Johnson such a great coach. And then just the personnel evals that Brian Flores has influenced here, and a lot of that perspective derives from the role he had in New England when he first started out as a scout in that building. And so what I will be curious to see over the next probably week is, who does Brian Flores meet with? Does he meet with teams for their defensive coordinator positions? And how real do those conversations become to where he then has leverage from a contractual perspective? That's where it's interesting. You guys are probably listening and asking the question, why would Brian Flores leave for a lateral defensive coordinator position? And there are a lot of ways I could go with this. What I've written, and I feel very convicted in what I've written on this, is that him leaving for a lateral defensive coordinator position would raise very difficult questions in a lot of respects. I mean, you could talk in a lot of ways, and I have, about the quarterback situation here. Coaches want to position themselves for the present and future, and oftentimes they are at the whim of what the quarterback situation looks like, and the uncertainty around the quarterback situation here makes things difficult as some of these coaches obviously eye the future and where they want to be. So that's one aspect of it. The another aspect that I have touched on in the past is Brian Flores is very direct. He's very strong-minded. He's unafraid to say what he wants and say what he thinks. And, in certain organizations, that is more probably it's easier to manage than others is what I would say. And so there's no denying the job that Brian Flores has done as the play caller, as the defensive coordinator in constructing the Vikings defensive scheme. And if he were to leave, it would place the Vikings in a precarious position where it would add more uncertainty to an offseason full of it. Now, the most obvious internal candidate for that job would be Durante Jones, who's been the defensive pass game coordinator. He's coached the secondary. He was a DC, I believe, in 2021 at LSU. He's been in a ton of different systems. He's coached with Zimmer. He's coached with Ed Donatel. He's coached with Flores. So a lot of philosophies, a lot of ideas. He is well respected from the players, and he would be the most obvious internal candidate and name for the job if Brian Flores were to depart. And there are a lot of people within the industry, not just in the Vikings building, who believe that Durante Jones is going to be a defensive coordinator and will be a really good defensive coordinator. But when you have change, like Detroit saw this past season, it adds a level and a layer of, I'll just use the word again, uncertainty to teams trying to maintain a certain level of performance that they've had in the past. And when you are where the Vikings are, and there is as many questions as there are, it would be really difficult to then have potentially be not on as much solid ground with your defensive unit as you feel like you've been the last couple of years. That would just be difficult. So that's another one where it's just a monitor situation in the days and week and weeks to come, and kind of see where things go from there. As far as other topics that I feel like are worth hitting this week and from Tuesday, the first would be Mike Pettine is retiring. Mike Pettine has been an assistant head coach with Kevin O'Connell since he got here. Mike was really one of the first to believe in Kevin O'Connell when Kevin was a backup in New York, invited him in some of their defensive meeting rooms, had Kevin break down the Patriots offense, design blitzes. I mean, that was Kevin's arrival here and tabbing Mike Pettine as his assistant head coach made a lot of sense. What I would say is Mike Pettine coached the outside linebackers in 2024, was moved off that position for Thad Bogertis before this past season. And I don't believe the Mike Pettine retirement to be a massive, you're not losing someone who has a day-to-day, hands-on, really integral design, defensive scheme component of this Vikings team. As far as other aspects of the staff, Kevin O'Connell did not wade into it on Tuesday, which does not at all mean that there's no other changes. I've written this, and I did in my season wrap-up story from a couple weeks ago, that there was a lot of coaching uncertainty beyond Brian Flores on the defensive side, definitely. And then we'll see as far as the offense goes, what potential changes are made. It just sounded like there were a lot of coaches whose contracts were up. And so I would also, similar to the Brian Flores defensive coordinator conversation, until you see how a lot of this coaching environment shakes out, who's available and who's not, and who wants to go where, and who's it's a very fluid topic. because there is very little cement dried on that, that sphere, that area of the league right now, just talking about coaching in general, and who's going to be where and who's not going to be where. So yeah, that's what I'd say on the staffing front. Felt like it was interesting that Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, when he was asked about Christian Darrisaw, he said time is on our side as far as Christian being further removed from the torn ACL and MCL. But he also said that he needs to be mindful of depth at that position, which is something that I've written about. I wrote about it last week, that coaches throughout the 2025 season were pretty uncertain if Christian would play certain weeks, if he did play, how long he would play certain weeks. And while, yes, the Vikings did snag insurance in Justin School, this team, it feels to me, really needs to be proactive in acquiring depth at that position. And that's one with the draft that I would say feels like a no-brainer to me come April, whether it's an early round pick for a guy who can potentially ascend as a starter, be it at left tackle if needed, or right tackle, given Brian O'Neill's contract. And the Vikings love Brian O'Neill, and an extension would allow the team to move money, so that would not surprise me at all. But still think tackle depth and acquiring it via the draft makes a ton of sense this upcoming April. What I would also say, and it leads into a bigger discussion of, a lot of conversation has been about the draft misses. And I mean, it's the lifeblood of an organization, drafting and developing. But the facet that doesn't get as much discussion is the developmental aspect of that two-pronged conversation. Like, you have to select the right players, but you also have to be in a position with coaching staff and to develop those players optimally. And I'd say, if you look at this team and the development of certain draftees over the last 4 seasons, that has been an area that it warrants conversation as well. I feel like Jay Ward really started to come on. The development on the interior defensive line has been good when you're talking about Jalen Redmond and Levi Drake Rodriguez. The development with Jalen Naylor at receiver is one that is a feather in the cap. The special teams development, if you're talking about Will Reichard and even Ryan Wright with the year he had this past season, coming off some down years, that's relevant. But I just oftentimes feel like the conversation is one-pronged with, they don't draft well enough. And there's no question that this team hasn't drafted well enough, but the other component of it that does warrant discussion is the developmental side of that kind of continuum, is what I would say. And you have to have trust on both sides. You have to have coaches who believe in who's drafted, and you have to have a front office that believes that the coaches are going to develop who's drafted. And if you don't have that synergy together, then it becomes really, really hard to find young players who become the lifeblood of your organization moving forward. So just something, a little tangent that I'm not sure I even expected to go on, but one that feels relevant to me. Lastly, we'll talk about Jordan Addison. The details regarding his arrest are pretty clear at this point. He was arrested in Tampa. I believe it was the Seminole Hard Rock Casino at 3:46 a.m. The charge was for trespassing. It was a misdemeanor, and he was released on bond for $500. Look, I've said many times over the past few months, I've written it, that the Vikings really needed to take seriously the potential that it was worth extending Jalen Naylor, a guy who's been nothing but trustworthy on the field and off the field over the last 4 seasons, and potentially be open-minded to what might exist for Jordan Addison. Other teams are obviously going to be aware of the complications that Jordan has had off the field, and it's the arrest a few years ago for driving 140 miles per hour in a Lamborghini. It's the arrest 2 years ago for falling asleep in a Rolls Royce in Los Angeles. Now this situation, he was also held out of the first quarter in London for a coach's decision after being suspended 3 games. So by all accounts, you talk to people internally, they are high on Jordan Addison and who he is. But at this point, when you have a consistent string of situations, I really think you have to go down the road of being very wary of what it would look like to lose Jalen Naylor and then have all of your faith and trust be in Ty Felton's development. And while internally there's been positive reports about Ty Felton, it is a question mark when you're talking about a late 3rd round pick who had flaws coming out, whether it be drops, whether it be, not the most fluid of mover over the middle of the field. So that is where I'll go with that conversation. Is I at this point, if there is not serious internal discussion about the potential extension for Jalen Naylor and open-mindedness with Jordan Addison, I think that would be kind of a faulty approach moving forward. So that's where I'll end it. Any questions you got? I'm doing a mailbag later this week at The Athletic. So definitely check that out. If you got questions, we usually do those here, but I wanted to save that in print so I could be more, thoughtful, revelatory probably in that. So please go check that out later this week. Hoping to be back later this week with another podcast, do a little conversation with somebody in the field about where this team is. Looking forward to that. And then we'll have more in the coming weeks. If there are any changes made, we'll probably do emergency pods. Probably won't go 40 minutes. We'll do 15-minute little hits, which we might do more of on kind of a day-to-day here on the YouTube channel. So stay locked and in podcast feeds, Spotify or Apple. So stay tuned for that. You can subscribe, you can like, you can follow us on social media at Alec Lewis Show, at Alec_Lewis. Check out First Resource Bank. Please go hit up Unreal, find some nice clothing for your spring and workout plans. But yeah, that'll do it here for us at the Alec Lewis Show. And I cannot wait to talk to you very, very soon.